Welcome back to another class. I hope you had a great time learning in our previous class. And I'm hoping that you remember a lot of things from our previous class, but most importantly, that you still remember how we talked about Jesus being the central message of the entire Bible. We went through a great length to show that every book of the Bible ultimately is telling a story of Jesus, has a pointer to Jesus. And I remember giving you an assignment from the last class. I hope you attempted it, in addition to the PDF that I gave you, where we have some one sentence pointers to Jesus in every book. I ask you to look for about 3 to 5 others from each of those books. Anyways, I'm going to be expecting to hear from you in the comment section. Today, we are going to be looking at the structural overview of the Bible, the structural overview of the Bible. And we're going to break the Bible down into a structure that can help us to make sense of it. And we will move from there to take one step further to look at a breakdown of the Old Testament. So, the way I like us to think about it is this. We all know that the Bible is broken down into the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament having 39 books, the New Testament having 27 books. Now, if you don't know that, well, now you know. But let's take this a step further and look at it from this structural breakdown point of view, which is that each of the categories, whether the Old Testament or the New Testament, and by the way, in between it is a 400 silent years. It's usually called silent year. I prefer to call it prophetic silence year. Remember what we talked about at the beginning, that the Bible is not a world history, it is a prophetic history. So it's a prophetic silent period. And we're going to have a section where we'll talk about that in details. But back to the breakdown. So the way I like us to think about it is that some books are foundational. And here's what I mean by foundational. Think of foundation as the point where the instruction, the foundation, the structure for how things should go is being put together, or is being put in place. All right. And think of the second part, which is the historical. So remember, we started from the foundational and then the historical. The way I like to think about the historical is that after the foundation has been laid, where instructions have been given about how things should be done, in the historical, we now see people living out all of that. All right. So they are living out those instructions that have been given. And what we're going to see is how people live consistent with those instructions and how people live contrary to those instructions at the foundational level. And based on that, there is going to be reward for living consistent with those instructional things at the foundation, and there would be, of course, consequences for living contrary to those things at the foundational level. Now, all of that put together is the historical. Now, if you think about it, history is in itself is nothing but what a set of people have done at a particular time in a particular place. So however you can have many definitions, but ultimately that's what history boils down to. And that's what we're going to be looking at in the historical book. So the next set of books, we're trying to show us how people lived out during, in terms of history, consistent or contrary to the things set out at the foundation. Now, the third component is what I call the instructionals. Now, the instructional books, again, just as the name implies, the instructional books, it's sort of in between. Okay, so think about it this way. At the foundation, instructions were given about how to live. At historical, people started living out those instructions or living contrary to them. But instructions were coming to tell, either to remind the people why they should live consistent with the instructions at the foundation, or why the dangers of living contrary to those instructions. Now, for the most part, all of that came in form of prophecies and through men that were in the Old Testament called prophets. All right. Now, the equivalence of each of those ones you also find in the New Testament: the foundational, the historical, and the instructional. So, in the Old Testament, most of the foundational books, in fact, the foundational books were the first 5 books of Moses, the one you call the Torah or the Pentateuch, whatever name that worked best for you. And for the historical, that's where you have a lot of history book. And the key highlight of those historical moments will be kings and kingdoms. All right. And we will see that in details, not in this class, but in the next class. Finally, like I mentioned, the instructionals were more from the prophet. The instructions were coming more from the prophet, instructing the people, rebuking them, and telling them about the consequences of their action. If you flip to the New Testament component of it, you see a similar structure. The Gospels in the New Testament were equivalents of the foundational things. The Gospel were likely the things that Jesus taught. All right, Jesus was laying the foundation for what would later become the church. Historical is likely what you have in the book of Acts. It was all history. All right. And also, again, follow the same logic that I just explained now. And when you look at the instructional for the New Testament, that would be the letters, a lot of letters. Those letters were doing exactly the same thing that the prophets were doing to the people through history in the Old Testament. All of that will make sense as we go along. So we want to take this a step further, and we just want to look at the Old Testament. The Old Testament. What does the structure of the Old Testament look like? All right. So again, if you look at the Old Testament, like I mentioned, is composed of 5 books. The first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Likely what you see with Genesis is also several themes, and there are key characters that you have to study as you study the book of Genesis. People like Adam, people like Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, Moses are key characters you must pay attention to as you study through those books. But there are also certain key themes that characterize all of this book and kind of help us to make sense of everything that was happening. Okay, so you see key themes like creation, themes like judgment, redemption, the making of a people, leadership, covenant, and promises. These are some key themes that you see as you go through the foundational books from Genesis all the way through to Deuteronomy. But what do these again tell us? All right, just diving into it a little bit. So Genesis, starting with Genesis, Genesis means the beginning, and I bet you've used that in your everyday communication. All right, you say, oh, from the genesis of something, because it actually means beginning, and we've come to adopt it even in our English dictionary or in our English vocabulary or everyday use, that Genesis means the beginning of something. So it's a book of beginning, a lot of beginning. the beginning of birth, the beginning of death, the beginning of disobedience, the beginning of sin, the beginning of literally everything. In fact, I prefer to refer to Genesis as the beginning of the end. All right, because Genesis, when I think about it, is ultimately like a summary of the entire Bible. Okay, it shows us, it introduces us to literally everything we are going to see through the Bible. So it was a lot of beginning. But what was God doing at this beginning? Part of what God was doing at this beginning is that God was creating. Okay, God was creating. So there was a theme of creation, and God was creating heaven, earth, and all the things that we find in it, and creating man. Part of the things the theme that characterized Genesis is how God was building a kingdom. Okay, a kingdom where he's king and where the people rely on him for the instructions to live, as opposed to the people trying to figure out for themselves how to live, good or bad. Because as it turns out, man is very terrible at making decisions of good or bad. Not necessarily because he wants to be terrible at that, but because he lives in a world that is extremely complex. So the way I think about it is, when I was much younger, and my older siblings would have to make a lot of decisions, and in your case, maybe it's your parents making a lot of decisions of the clothes to wear, of the food to eat, and all of that. And you kind of want to grow up so fast so that you can have the freedom to be able to make those decisions. But let me ask you, how is that coming along? As you grow up, you discover that decision making is complex, and you really suddenly wish that someone can make all of those decisions for you. Now, that really is what the idea of the good and evil, as we saw in Genesis, was all about. It was God saying, rather than eating the fruit of good and evil and being able to discern good and evil for yourself, declaring that independence for yourself, I love you so much to not want to let you go through that. Rather, I want to be able to instruct you on what is good and what is evil, and just following that. As you read through the entire Bible, you discover that culture of a kingdom where God is the one who tells us what is good and what is evil ran through. So it's not about being smart enough to discern or good enough to tilt towards the good. It's about, ultimately, the only way to be good is to listen to God, the only one who actually knows good and evil. So God was building this kingdom. And of course, the first attempt we saw with Adam, Adam messed things up, right? By not accepting, rebelling against that kingdom and declaring independence. And we saw how things got really bad, and there was a theme of judgment through the flood and all of that. But I want to also pay attention to how that story was going and how God was recreating everything through one man, Abraham. And as God was recreating it, remember, part of the things God said about Abraham is that I know him. I know that he's going to instruct his family in the fear of God. Again, helping his family to accept the kingdom of God and to be able to submit to the will of God. So we saw a lot of that happening in Genesis. And ultimately, that book closed with the descendant of Abraham going into slavery. All right. Now, as we then come into Exodus, we saw a very interesting theme, which was a theme of deliverance, okay, and redemption. It was God bringing out his people out of slavery for a purpose. Moses talked about that. He said, so that they will worship me. That was what he told Pharaoh. He said, God said, let my people go so that they can worship me. Okay. And A good way to think about it is, as you read through the story of Exodus, it almost looked like God was playing this hide and seek game with Pharaoh. Do you feel that way too? Like, is God is powerful. He killed Pharaoh eventually, so to speak. The question is, why didn't he get rid of Pharaoh all along? Why was he doing this? Oh, I will show him one plague, and then Pharaoh will say, "Oh yeah, I'm so sorry, I want to repent now," and then he changed his mind, and it was almost like he was just, somehow God just allowed this game to go on and on. That's because God wasn't trying to kill Pharaoh, at least not yet. He was doing something bigger. Remember, the Israelites have been in this land for a very long time. They've been exposed to other gods. If God was bringing them out of this land, remember, in the future, God was going to tell them that they cannot serve any other god. Why was he doing that? Because they were already exposed to so many other gods. But God was going to tell them, you cannot serve any other god. You will serve only one God. Now, follow me logically for a minute. If I was going to instruct someone to forget about all other options and focus on one, you do realize that I must be able to also convince that person that that one thing that I'm asking the person to focus on is what all of these other things combine. So what God was doing with all of the plagues and with all of the miracles and all of the signs in Egypt was a direct attack against the different powerful gods of Egypt. Literally, so that God is somehow able to imprint this image in the minds of Israelites that, look, all the other gods, you saw how one by one I made a mess of them. So that now when he's calling them and he's asking them to serve only him, he has proven to them over time, right, that that singular choice is worth more than 1,000 gods combined. You get the gist. So in Exodus, it was more of a story of redemption and God demonstrating his power to the end of what he is going to be bringing the Israelites into as they go along. All right. Now, as we move from Exodus, we come to Leviticus. In Leviticus, what God was doing essentially was creating worship. Okay, he was building relationship and he was building worship. So he did two things in Leviticus. He created worship. Okay, again, he has already shown them his power. Now he's bringing them into worship. The second thing he's doing is building relationship with them. What does that mean? And I will explain that in a bit. Because God did two things majorly to be able to do that, right? In order for God to be able to build relationship with the Israelite, he introduced them to what we know as the sacrifice. Okay, so it taught them about different kind of sacrifices. Actually, not a lot. There were 5 of them, 5 sacrifices. 3 of those 5 are voluntary. The other 2 are involuntary. And just to quickly run you through the list. So let's start with the voluntary sacrifices. Okay. The voluntary one, number 1, we have the burnt offering. So the whole idea of the burnt offering, think about it as an offering of consecration, an offering of devotion. Again, it is voluntary. your devotion has to be voluntary anyway. God doesn't want to force you, but you have to voluntarily submit. So it's an offering of devotion, and it's symbolic in the way that it's being offered, which is that everything is totally burnt. Okay, the bones, the meat, the organs of the animal are totally burnt, which is symbolic of what our devotion should be. It should be whole, complete, full. All right. The second offering that we see is what you call the grain offering. Okay, the grain offering. Now, the grain offering is fruit of the field, okay, which was offered to God in form of a baked cake that is made of fine flour. And the whole idea of it is to express gratitude unto God. Again, it is optional, okay, but God encouraged them to do it. So, offering of gratitude. So, the first one is offering of devotion, burnt offering, grain offering, offering of gratitude. And the third one under the voluntary is similar to that. It's called the peace offering. It is doing two things. It is both an offering of appreciation, but more importantly, an offering of fellowship. An offering of fellowship. And it's symbolic in the way that that is being offered, because the high priest would also have a share in part of the meat that is being offered. So those are the three that are voluntary. Okay, I hope you are with me. The burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering. Now, again, the grain offering is being offered side by side with the drink offering. The same way the peace offering, the pieces of it are called the wave offering, because it is of the way it's conducted is waved unto the Lord. All right. So, but let's move now to the ones that are mandatory. So I told you there are 5 of them. 3 are voluntary, 2 are mandatory. So the first one of those 2 that are mandatory, the first one is called the sin offering. Again, just as the name implies, is the offering that you bring when there is a defilement, when you've defiled yourself, and there were a lot of rules about how you can defile yourself: touching a dead body, having menstrual cycle, and a lot of other things like that. So there are different ways. They are all largely physical. Okay, but once you are unclean, basically, you cannot approach this holy God. He is not angry with you. He just does not tolerate that sin or that impurity. So all you have to do is become pure, offer the sacrifice, become pure, and then you can approach God. Okay. And the second one, of course, in this mandatory offering is called the trespass offering. Now, the trespass offering, and you begin to get a sense when the Bible was speaking in the New Testament about your sins and trespasses. Now you know that there are 2 different things. The trespass offering is basically offering for forgiveness of a sin you committed unintentionally, basically. So that's the difference. So both sin offering and trespass offering are doing the same thing, but one is for unintended sin. So these were sacrifices and offerings that God gave to them in order for them to be able to learn the art of relationship with Him. In addition to that, remember I talked about the fact that God gave them 2 things. He started building relationship with them in Exodus, and He did that by introducing them to how they can relate with Him, a holy God. And He did that by showing them the way of sacrifice, the sacrifice to be committed, the sacrifice of thanksgiving, of appreciation, of fellowship, of restoration of a communion or access. He showed them all of that. So he was building relationship. The second thing was that he was teaching them the art of worship. And he did that by instituting festivals. There are 7 festivals that were, God instituted for the Israelites. 7 of them. So let me run quickly through the 7 of them, just so you take note. The first one is the Passover. Passover essentially is, again, all of these were commemorations. The whole idea is that there are different times in the life of Israelites, significant moments. God wants to bring them into remembrance of those things so that they may continue to worship Him. Okay, that's what the whole idea of the worship is all about, and the reason why those festivals were instituted. So I was talking about Passover. Passover is essentially a remembrance of the night that they were freed from Egypt. Okay, a remembrance of the night that they were freed from Egypt. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread, followed that closely. In fact, Passover typically in the Jewish calendar, when you translate it to our English calendar or our Gregorian calendar, will fall somewhere around April 14 thereabout. So April 15 would be Feast of Unleavened Bread, okay, which is the second feast. And it's simply also a remembrance of what happened the night, before that Passover, when God asked them to eat bread without yeast and all of that. So it was part of the remembrance of that night. So that's the second feast that God asked them to continually remember. The third one is the Feast of First Fruit, which was essentially prophetic. God was saying to them that when you get into that land that I promise you, there is going to be abundance, your crop, your land will grow fertile and all of that. But bring the first harvest of that field before me as a way of appreciating me, that you remember that I brought you out of Egypt and I established you in this land and I gave you that abundance. Okay, so that's the third one. The fourth one that follow closely in that order is what you call the Feast of Weeks, or what you popularly known as Pentecost. Okay, Pentecost, I know, is now more synonymous to the Holy Spirit because of the event that happened in the New Testament, but technically Pentecost just meant 50. Okay, it's a Greek word that meant 50th. Okay, it happened 50 days after the feast of the first fruit. And basically what Pentecost is doing is to mark or celebrate the end of grain harvest. Okay, the end of grain harvest. That is now being followed closely by what you call the Feast of Trumpet. Feast of Trumpet. It means exactly that. It's a feast where they blow trumpet. But on a lighter note, but on a serious note, it's a feast, yes, actually, where they blow trumpet. But that trumpet is significant of something. It is commemorative of the end of agricultural cycle. Okay, it's to announce to people that agricultural season is winding down. But more importantly, it is also the whole idea of making that announcement is for people to now begin to reflect on their life, how they've lived their life all through that period. Were they grateful to God? Were they greedy in the way that they handle things and all of that? Because that is important, especially because of the next feast that follows that is called the Day of Atonement. Okay, the Day of Atonement is that one day in a year where the priest goes into the holies of holies in the temple or in the tabernacle and offer a sacrifice for the purity of all of Israel, for all of the sins that they've committed and all of that. And then the last one is called the festival or the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, Feast of Tabernacles or Feast of Booths. The whole idea of the Feast of Booths is a 7-day festival and it comes 5 days after the Day of Atonement. It's celebrated over a 7-day period, and basically it's supposed to remind them. So during that period, they live in temporary housing arrangement. The whole idea is to remind them how they lived when God took them out of Egypt and how they live in the wilderness and all of that. God was reminding them all of that. So if you look at all of these feasts and festivals, they were supposed to bring Israel into continuously keeping God on their mind, remembering the things that God has done for them. This is worship, and this is what God was giving to them in Leviticus. As you move to Numbers, what was God doing in Numbers? It's interesting because Numbers began with a lot of numbers. God was taking a census of the people. Now, think about it this way. In Genesis, we already saw his hand. In Exodus, he already delivered them through his mighty hand. And he already told them, look, I want to be your God. Now, in Leviticus, he already instituted an act of worship. All of that was supposed to strengthen their faith, right? This God that they worship, the whole worship idea is supposed to remind them of God's deliverance and to help them know that God is with them. But God did a final thing to really prove to them that he is with them. And you see that when you read the first couple of chapters, the first two chapters of the book of Numbers. It was a lot of numbers, but it was a census and arrangement. God gave them a specific arrangement of how they should arrange themselves, right? To the west, to the east, to the south, and to the north. Okay, and this arrangement is very deliberate, putting two things into consideration. Number one, the size of a particular tribe determines where God wants them to be. The size. Number two, the tribe itself. So, for instance, Levi, which was supposed to take care of the temple and all of that, they were asked to camp around the temple. The tabernacle was at the center. The Levites camp around that. And so if this is what that would look like visually, right? So you see to the west, the tribes that of Benjamin and Manasseh and Ephraim were there. To the east, you saw Judah and Issachar and Zebulun. So this size. And the reason why this size is important is because when you now look at this formation, it gives you two pictures. Well, two in one. One is that the tabernacle is at the center. The tabernacle is where God dwells. So this was God showing to them that he is the center of their life. But it also formed a picture of the cross. So right there in the Old Testament, again, speaking about Jesus being the central point of the entire story. All right. So if you were to look at them from a mountain view, this is what it will look like. Can you see God in being the center of their life? All right, being in the center and making it impossible for enemy to overcome them. All right, and they're forming the picture of the cross. We saw the cross right there as early as the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. So you get the picture. But the second thing that God was now doing based on that, now that God has been able to use all of these things to prove to them that he is with them, he is now making a demand of them. Would you trust me enough now to step into what I've called you into? And that's the point where they had to go and spy the land. Okay, they spied the land and they discovered that, 10 people brought negative report. We can't take over the land. And you still remember the story. Only 2 people, Joshua and Caleb, came back with good report. And because of that, it was more like, despite all these things that they've seen, that were supposed to be sufficient proof that this God is able to deliver them, they did not trust God. And that act of faithlessness led them to all, the Bible tells us, all of them perish. All that generation perished in the wilderness. And that brings us to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy simply means a second law. So as you read through Deuteronomy, you probably see a lot of what seems like repetition, which is um, um, some of the things you've seen in Leviticus, Numbers, and all of that being repeated again. That's because the generation that all of those instructions were given to, they had all died. And now God was building another generation. I was asking them, your forefathers were too afraid to step into what my will for them. And God was saying, will you be ready to step into my will for you? Okay, that's what the whole of Deuteronomy was all about. It was God revisiting the terms of agreement again, or as I like to put it, God was giving them a second chance, because our God is always a God of second chance. And as we close out today's class, I just want to remind you of that one truth. Our God is a God of a second chance. It doesn't matter if you have missed it in your life at any point, God is a God of a second chance and is willing to give you a second chance. So, with that, we close out today's class, and I will see you in the next class where we will be looking at the historical books, how the people live through history. See you.